Good evening, everyone.
Good evening, sir.
Good evening. Good evening. Um, I welcome everybody to today's webinar on transaction law. This topic is particularly important in the context of corporate law, especially because transactions are really the basis on which most important deal structuring and business structuring takes place. But before we get to all that, let me just quickly introduce myself for some of our outside participants. So basically, I'm a faculty at KIIT Law School, and I also head the entrepreneurship cell in the School of Law, KIIT University, and of course, my research interests lie in corporate law, more specifically competition law and mergers and acquisitions. Keeping that in mind, I have designed this webinar in a way so that the idea is to basically give all of you a sneak peek into what really goes on into the world of deal structuring, how exactly mergers, acquisitions, startup investments, how or on what basis are they acquired, and on what basis the foundation is laid for future businesses. So this particular webinar has been designed keeping that in mind. So let's begin. And the first topic that we'll discuss now is basically the what constitutes corporate law. So most of us, we have been taught about corporate law that it deals with company law, deals with aspects of shares, debentures, share transfers. But transaction law is something which is neglected usually because at the student level, our basic aim is to just quickly go through our semesters and be done with the subject, but that's not really how the world of corporate law works. And so transaction law being a neglected part, that I have picked up as today's topic, and it's more relevant now, especially in light of the COVID pandemic. So I'll share my screen with all of you so that we get an idea as to what exactly transaction law means, and then we'll proceed step by step to the different aspects of transaction law. What are the skills required? We'll discuss some basic examples, some loopholes as well. So let me share my screen with all of you so that you can see the definition of what constitutes transaction law. I hope this is visible.
Yes, sir.
All right. So as you can see now, this basically is my most recent paper that I've published in an international journal, and this paper basically talks about the different aspects of corporate law, and more specifically, where is artificial intelligence integrated into big data analysis for doing due diligence. Because as all of you know, due diligence is a prerequisite before going forward with any sort of corporate transaction. You are required to investigate into the company's affairs so that ex post the transaction, nothing contrary to the law, nothing which is in conflict with the law that can come up, right? So if you go through this paragraph, this part here that defines what transaction law is, right? Is this highlighted portion visible, all of you?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
So as you can see, this is the kind of work which is involved in for transaction lawyers. So the people who do this kind of stuff, they are those people who do not represent their client in a court of law. Their work is primarily confined to their desks. Their work is primarily confined to negotiation with their clients, research, drafting of agreements, and sometimes advisory services as well, because you have to negotiate a lot of times before you even go for documenting the pre-transaction documents, right? So this highlighted portion, that is commercial contracts, due diligence, and advisory work as well, which I've mentioned here, that law firms perform background checks before they legitimize corporate transactions. So theoretically, this is another category, but in real practice, what happens is this is merged with the first category of work, that is corporate advisory services are also merged with corporate transactional law services, because most corporate law firms, the big corporate law firms, have two sets of teams. So one is your general corporate, and the other one is your mergers and acquisitions, where most of the transaction law implementation happens, right? So starting from big ticket investments like let's say the recent example of the Facebook Geo deal, or Zomato, which is receiving investment from a Chinese investor, Tencent. All of these things are examples of transaction lawyers, right? And so basically, the law part is more concerned with drafting and research rather than on hardcore litigation, which you see in forums like NCLT, right? So this is a holistic idea of what goes on around this aspect of transaction law. And so basically transaction law is therefore a very important part of corporate law, right? So if you say that you are a student of corporate law, and as an along you go about your semesters and then eventually into your final year as well, you will be expected to know some of these terms. Terms like due diligence, terms like who are transaction lawyers, terms like bootstrapping, where startup raises investment out of their own savings. So these sort of things. Terms, for example, like financial investment, strategic investment, right? So these sort of things are very important from a conceptual point of view if you are a transaction lawyer, because all of your work, most of your work will be done behind the scenes, right? So if any litigation happens, it will only be because some party has been able to manipulate a clause in the transaction agreement, in the final documentation, to their favor. So your job is to reduce, and if not reduce, at least prevent the origin of any kind of future litigation for any of your clients. Is this clear?
Yes, sir.
Right, right. So this is in brief about the aspects of the different aspects of transaction law. Moving forward, when we talk about transaction law, for your convenience, what I've done is I have divided transaction law into two parts. So one is what you call a skill specific transaction law, because as I told you, you need a lot of skill sets, both hard as well as soft skills, for executing the transaction. So if on appearance your client does not get this vibe that okay, I can open up more about my deal which I want to enter into, no matter how many times you pursue the client, you will not get much information. So transaction lawyering really requires a combination of soft skills like good communication skills, people management, because you have to coordinate with a lot of departments if you are working at a law firm, right? Even if you are an independent advocate, still you need to coordinate with your peers occasionally, because there are regulatory compliances which you might need to do. So people skills, communication skills, negotiation skills, which are all soft skills, basically are a prerequisite if you are looking to become a transaction lawyer. And so far as hard skills are concerned, that is your technical legal skills which we talk about, those include things like good writing skills, research skills as well, proper drafting. So these are the areas where you should try to work on if you really want to be a good transaction lawyer, because time and again you will see that while drafting agreements you require to negotiate a lot with your client. Sometimes what happens is, like, let's say if you are drafting a shareholders agreement, the final clauses have been drafted, and at the last minute the investor raises a particular concern regarding some clause in the agreement. By that time your agreement has already been drafted, correct? So in such a scenario you again have to go back, uh, probably modify the clause a little bit in the investor's favor, but not so much that it affects your business. So that requires a healthy channel of communication on a regular basis. So, and again, you have to do a lot of research as well before drafting a certain clause. Let's say a force majeure clause is required to be inserted in the agreement. And in the force majeure clause, you have missed a particular Supreme Court judgment which briefly delineates what can be considered within the ambit of the FM clause, and you draft such a clause, then in that case, who is to be responsible, right? So it is really a matter of a combination of soft skills and hard skills that make you reach towards an optimum clause that you are going to draft. But this is just a very small example. There could be numerous such examples of faulty drafting, and of course we'll discuss that during the course of this webinar as well. So like I mentioned, it's a combination of hard and soft skills, and so this is within the category of skill specific transaction law, where you divide it into hard and soft skills. But transaction law can also be analyzed from the point of view of the subjects or the industries or the sectors in which transaction law can be made applicable, right? I assume most of us have heard about the term fintech or financial technologies. So all your applications like Paytm, Google Pay, and all of that come within the ambit of fintech, and these are basically those startups, those companies which provide you with digital wallets, payment bank services, and whatnot within their umbrella. So this area right now, as of today, is one of the most emerging areas in corporate law, and this does not really require you. For example, take now, for instance, we are slowly emerging from the lockdown, yes, but still most of our work is getting remotely done, right? So but that does not prevent you from having a good communication with, let's say, the founder of a startup who wants to enter into this business. He wants to get an idea about how the regulatory compliances are to be done, what sort of documentation should he require, what sort of pre and post transaction compliances he needs. All of this can be done even if you're sitting at home and using your mobile phone, right? So based on negotiations like this, then you go about researching, which can be a little bit of problem because you may not have access to all of your resources. But of course, basic research can be done on how to draft agreements, what are boilerplate clauses in the different agreements, and then drafts of these things can be circulated with the client. So my point is essentially that this kind of work does not really depend on whether the courts are open or not, right? Regardless of the fact that you are going somewhere for trial, for any sort of kind of litigation, for any proceeding, the advantage that transaction lawyers get is even remotely they can add value for their client. So that's the biggest advantage that you have if you are a transaction lawyer. And of course, from a subject point of view, technology law, fintech laws, cryptocurrencies, these are all emerging areas in corporate law. So I hope all of you can see the screen which I have shared for you. Is it visible? Is the screen visible, everyone?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
All right, all right. So let me take you to the most happening areas in corporate law. I should say this part is basically where all of the corporate law work, in fact, 70 to 80% of the corporate law work is being done if you are a transaction lawyer. So things like artificial intelligence, cryptocurrencies, IP licensing, smart contracts, which are basically blockchain based contracts. So you don't need to execute them on their own, they are self executing contracts. Drone licensing, cloud based businesses. So these are some new emerging technology based areas where every day at least 10 to 15 startups are laying their foundation for this, and they are in dire need of good corporate lawyers. So this is where law students can add value, because these startups do not really have that much resources to hire a good top-notch corporate lawyer from a good firm. But what they can do is, if you showcase your ability as a student to these startups and maybe work freelancing for some time, let's say you want to research on IP licensing or how drone licensing works, understand the industry, understand the regulations, right? Do a little bit of research, talk about it with your client, gain their confidence first, right? And maybe it is possible that if you keep up with this work, they might just give you some work on your side. So at the time of taking the work, you may not realize that you are entering into a niche industry where nobody has entered before. So in essence, this could also be an opportunity for you to make a name for yourself in an industry where virtually there is no competition. Because traditionally, if you see, the legal profession is such which shies away from um, embracing technological developments. Not just in India, but it also happens in countries like US, UK, even the developed jurisdictions. So this could be an opportunity for future budding corporate lawyers if you are interested in how transactions are closed, if you want to know about the emerging sectors in which you can do this kind of work. The COVID has created the right opportunity for you because everything is being done remotely. So the startups who are newly looking for these things and they're looking for some basic legal compliance, you can guide them on these things, and of course you can guide them in setting up their businesses. That means setting up as a partnership, as a company, as a limited liability partnership. So these sort of things are always there as an opportunity for you. So the point being that if you're a transaction lawyer, you don't really need to worry about whether the courts are open or not. Your work is ensured that you do it to the best of your ability. If you are a student, of course, do not expect right away that the startups will start paying you. That's not going to happen. But you gain their trust, you gain their confidence, keep at it, and you might just make a name for yourself, create a niche for yourself. So that was the summary of the areas into which transaction law can operate now. Of course, traditional corporate law areas are also there. For instance, joint venture in any traditional industry, let's say pharmaceuticals or real estate sector, those things have always been there in corporate law. But this technology law practice is a new area, and when you combine it with transaction lawyering, it's a very creative area as well, because the outside impression for us legal professionals is, if you ask anybody, they might say, and somebody who is not really aware about the legal developments, they would say, okay, you are into law, it is probably a boring profession. But also transaction lawyering is much more than drafting. It allows you to really create something out of nothing. So you're like an architect creating a blueprint for a building design. So that's the opportunity which is there for you. In the second part of the webinar, of course, we'll discuss how to approach startup lawyers, startups, and how to secure those internships or maybe some freelancing work. But for now, we'll move to the next part of the webinar, which is I'll talk a bit about the different terminologies which are very frequently used in case of transaction law, right? So every day, or if not every day, at least very frequently in many of the business newspapers, we read something about mergers, acquisitions, joint ventures, private equity investment into startups, hedge fund investment into startups. And sometimes we really get confused about the deal itself because the terminologies are quite complex, right? So just to clear everything up, there are certain terms which you should be quite familiar with. One being, for example, that transaction lawyers are in the business of what you call deal structuring. So they create, their job is to bring people together to negotiate a deal. That agreement becomes the foundation for a future mergers and acquisition process. Like, for instance, you take a shareholders agreement. As an investment is finalized, you enter into an SHA, the investor brings a lot of money, you give the investor certain rights. So that SHA, that aspect of shareholders agreement, the entire agreement which you have drafted, is something which is not done by litigation lawyers. That is done by transaction lawyers. So this is where your importance lies, right? So as transaction lawyers, you will be doing this kind of work, making sure that not only the clauses are very precise and specific, you have done your research, you have negotiated well, but also keeping in mind that you draft your clauses in a manner so that to the maximum extent possible, you reduce chances of future litigation, because it's a waste of your client's money, it's a waste of the opposite side's time and money as well. So no party wants that, correct? So these kind of things are essential in a transaction lawyering setup. Now, Regarding documentation and the different agreements which are there, let me just quickly take you to the different kind of agreements which you can draft, or more specifically, let me just take you to certain examples where transaction lawyering happens, and you have to figure that out as to how transaction lawyering can be delineated from this. So I'll share my screen with all of you once again. Okay, so is this visible? This agreement's visible?
Yes, sir.
Right. So this is basically a term sheet for an investment. It's a non-binding agreement from between the investor and the startup founder. So the objective is to briefly delineate certain important clauses before they are drafted into the shareholders agreement. So all these clauses, promoters, price per share, dividends, voting rights, affirmative rights, these are all part of your work, that is transaction lawyers work, a document to specifically mention which clauses should be included in the shareholders agreement and which should not be there, right? So this is one document which is known as a term sheet. It is executed just before the investment, and it's a non-binding agreement. Similarly, there is another agreement which is also known as co-founders agreement. This co-founders agreement is basically when you are about to start your business, and you have certain people who are interested in the business along with you. You are seeking any funding, let's say family, friends, any kind of angel investor, right? So they bring along funding for you, but this agreement specifies what responsibilities you will have as a future founder of your business. How will you incorporate with your business? What kind of mutual rights and obligations will the co-founders have? Now remember, this is immediately before you incorporate your business. So today, if your company has already been incorporated, most of these clauses that you see here will be inserted into the articles of association or partnership deed or an LLP deed, right? And then the importance of this document will not be there. So this kind of documents you will usually get to draft at the initial stages of a business. Along with that, also articles of association and maybe memorandum or LLP agreement if it's an LLP or a partnership deed. But as and along your business grows, the business scales up, you receive more funding, right? There you will get to draft something which is known as a shareholders agreement. So basically, a shareholders agreement looks like this. Let me share the link with you. Am I audible, all of you?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
All right, all right. So just give me a minute. I'll share the template of a share subscription agreement with you. So, yeah, so this document is basically the final investment agreement, where once you have cleared the queries in the term sheet, I hope you can see this share subscription agreement.
Yes, sir.
All right. So this share subscription agreement is when an investor or a shareholder subscribes to your shares for the first time, right? So if you are a venture capital investor or any other financial investor that is a short-term investor, once everything materializes, the term sheet has been signed, then a due diligence is done. And after that due diligence, if all the conditions have been fulfilled, then this share subscription agreement is the first final definitive agreement which is signed between the parties. And it has binding clauses, unlike the other documents which we saw, like a co-founders or a term sheet agreement, right? So shareholders agreement can have, and in fact, almost all the clauses in the shareholders agreement, most of the clauses will be binding unless specifically mentioned to be non-binding clauses, right? So this is basically a template of the shareholders agreement, the different clauses that you can see. So we'll not go into much detail because we don't have much time in that regard. But now what I'll do is let's discuss some examples of transaction law. Okay, where because of the fact that the transaction aspect is something which, as unless you are working at a law firm or some other organization, you will not have access to obvious confidential documents. So what I've done is I have made a compilation of some of the latest investment transactions which is going on at the moment, and from there we will identify which one is a strategic investment and which is a financial investment. So let's take the example of this first. Just give me a sec. Yeah. Is it visible, this page? I hope this page is visible.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
All right. Okay. So now, see, as you can see, so this is just a headline. So EdTech startup Vedantu, it raises 100 million, double valuation to 600 million in just 3 months. So we'll not go into the financial aspect, but what is important to understand here is the kind of investment that we are talking about. Okay, so here this startup is basically a startup which is in the education sector. So it provides coaching materials for entrance examinations, as you can see. And what is important to understand here is this is a financial investment, because looking at the nature of the investor, which is a hedge fund. Now, these people are short term investors. So they pool in money from different high net worth individuals and invest in a certain company for, let's say, 4 to 5 years. And then when the company goes for an initial public offering, they'll leave based on an exit valuation. So these people are financial investors. But to get to this part, a lot of documentation is required, because before a startup raises something of this much magnitude, you need to have documents like term sheet and let's say co-founders agreement, non-disclosure agreement, so that something confidential is not revealed, shareholders share subscription agreement, which are often merged together. So it is after months of deliberation, probably due diligence will take time during this time, that you reach a level like this. Because see here, if you see the who are the popular investors that have invested so far, Tiger Global, VC firm, means a venture capital firm. These are all the investors so far who have invested. So the whenever you see these terms, private equity, venture capitalists, these are all investors who are there for the short time, right? So this is basically a financial investment. So here, what is the role of transaction law? You will have to negotiate a lot before you even reach what the client wants from you. You reach that stage. In order to do that, keep negotiating on and off, keep researching on whatever the client tells you, and then only then you can draft the final clauses, final agreements which the client will expect you to deliver. So this is a very tough job, in the sense that you require a lot of patience to draft agreements like this, but at the same time it allows opportunity for you to be creative as well. Because current situation, if you see the pandemic and everything that is going on right now, there are two clauses which have taken prominence now. One is what you call force majeure clause, and the other one is what is known as a material adverse change clause. So these two clauses have taken center stage right now. These are ordinarily not invoked unless something extraordinary happens, and that is what has happened right now. So force majeure is basically an impossibility of event. It traces its roots to Section 56 of the Indian Contract Act, where the contract could be nullified on account of impossibility of performance. And material adverse change is a technical term which is used to basically get away from your obligation in an investment contract. So let's say the COVID-19 situation which is there, it is quite possible that investment agreements will have a clause in relation to an MAC clause, that is a material adverse change clause, where they will explain what events qualify as an MAC. That is material adverse change. And of course, nobody anticipated a pandemic of this nature. So you cannot really blame the parties for, let's say, if your supply chain is disturbed and you cannot meet the demand on time. It's not really the party's fault during these times. So an MAC clause in such a situation will document and will codify. It will tell the investor, it will tell the company that the investor is free to pull out his funding if something materially alters the objective of the whole transaction, like in this case. Although no court so far has gone ahead and said that COVID is a situation of an MAC, but the finance ministry did say that COVID-19 qualifies as a force majeure, which means it's quite possible that for investment agreements, they might use COVID as a situation to a material adverse change clause. And so therefore, the idea is that if at all such a clause is there, if you are from the founder's side, if you're from the investor's side, you simply need to insist that you insert a representation and warranty clause in the agreement, which is basically a clause that tells you that the person, the founder of the startup or the founders will indemnify the investor or the investors on the happening of so and so events. So this kind of creativity you get if you are into transaction law business. Now, coming to the last part of my webinar, that is how can law students really approach startup lawyers. Now, this is something where your soft skills will play a very crucial role, because like I speak to a lot of entrepreneurs and also some startup lawyers on a frequent basis. The most that I've heard from them about legal internship is that even if you are sitting at home online and you want to do some legal work, so the first thing that they'll make you do is they'll make you personally contact some of the members in the startup, right? So you'll have to probably go for a Zoom meeting with those guys and sit with them, know about their commercial intent, uh, probably speak with them on the phone, speak with them during the meeting, and then eventually the lawyer under whom you might get an internship or secure will ask you to advise on what do you think the commercial intent of the business is, right? So your first job is to identify what is the commercial intent that I get from this particular investment transaction that is going to happen, because based on the commercial intent, you will do the drafting part, right? So the way you approach for a law student, if you really want to get into this niche area, you should really start working on your LinkedIn profile. You can update it, because nobody these days looks at your CV. Your LinkedIn profile is your online CV, and even if you don't have a physical hard copy of it right now, your LinkedIn profile should be enough. It's a make or break situation as far as securing internships are really concerned. So you need to make sure that your LinkedIn profile is up to date. You need to make sure that you keep communication open with whoever it is you are approaching. And while applying for internships, even if they do not have a vacancy right then, you can always send them a piece of your work. Let's say you've written an article on startup valuation. Let's say you've written an article on strategic investment, or you have written an article on the aspects of, let's say, financial investment. You want to write on Reliance and Facebook, the deal which happened, right? So you need to show them that you are capable enough to do some research and you are familiar with the writing skills, with the legal research skills, with the presentation skills as well. So
Sorry to
gain some,
interrupt. Sorry to interrupt,
yeah.
sir, but if you want, we can arrange another session for you because we have only 1 minute left. Students have certain
Uh,
queries.
yeah, I'll be winding up shortly. So you can post the queries in the chat box if you want. I can answer.
I've already posted.
Is it there? Let me
Yes.
check. Okay. So there's one question from. Okay, Priyanka has this question. If I want to do freelancing,
It
how
will
am I
end
supposed
only
to?
in 2 minutes.
Yes, yes. So the question that's being asked is freelancing work, how you're supposed to get. So like I said, you need to approach them on LinkedIn because most of these startups and entrepreneurs are there in that profile, and you need to make sure that I discussed this, that you have to invest in your soft skills and hard skills as well. Impress them with your research and writing work. There's another question from Molly that suppose my boss gives me a standard NDA, what are the main points I can keep in mind? In an NDA, basically the main idea is that you define your ambit of confidentiality. That's all that matters. The rest are just boilerplate clauses that you need to customize. I hope